Hello, and welcome to the International Postdoc Forum for the Philosophy of Science. My name is Alan Love. I'm the director of the Minnesota Center for Philosophy of Science, and it's my great pleasure to host today's event. A little bit of background might be useful to just understand the origin of the forum. Was something that we initiated during COVID-19, and when people lost opportunities for travel and additionally the opportunities to present work at conferences and other sorts of venues. And we decided to initiate that when everybody was living in Zoom. And now that things are shifting and we're no longer always on Zoom, we had such tremendous response that people wanted to continue it, that we have been doing that and plan to do so for the foreseeable future. The goal of the program is to showcase virtual research presentations from international scholars with commentaries from local Minnesota Center for Philosophy of Science community members. And it's my great pleasure today to introduce Dr. Ty Branch, who's at Concept, the Cologne Center for Contemporary Epistemology and the Kantian tradition at the University of Cologne. They'll be speaking on the value-free ideal and the resilience of the deficit model in science communication. And before I turn things over to Ty, let me highlight our procedure, which is that Ty will make their presentation, and then we will have the commentary from Ben McMyler, who I will introduce at that point. And then we will also have an opportunity for Ty to respond to Ben's comments, and then open questions and answers and discussion from that point onward. You are able to ask questions verbally or through the Q&A function. Either is fine. So with that, I will get off the stage and turn things over to Ty. Ty, the floor is yours.
Hello. I hope you can hear me and see me.
Yes, you're coming through fine.
Perfect. All right, then. So let me start by saying thank you, Professor Love, for this invitation to come and share some of my research. I've been thinking about the value-free ideal and science communication for quite some time now. This is work I've done with Heather Douglas, and I look forward to Benjamin's comments to help us further think about this subject matter. I also have to thank Keely and Janet for offering technical support, because these sorts of events don't work seamlessly without it. So with that in mind, let me provide a bit of background as to why this subject interests me, because I think it frames a lot of what I do. My undergraduate degree was in biochemistry, and although I really enjoyed being in the laboratory, science wasn't quite my best use of talent. And so I ended up being called to work in science centers. And while I was fortunate enough to work in several science centers in Canada, the consistent question that I found myself asking was, why do we present science this way? And it didn't seem to matter whether I was working on older instruments or doing provenance research or thinking about how to bring forth new exhibits. There always seemed to be an undercurrent or an idea of how to present science, a norm established about how science was going to face the public. And this led me down the philosophy rabbit hole of asking, why do we think of science in this way? And so this work is in part a response to that question. So for my talk, I'm going to give a few starting points that I hope sort of situate, but in ways ultimately show the limitations of what this research is about. I'm going to offer some context specifically with regard to some earlier work that I think sets up what I'm going to say about science communication and the deficit model towards the end. And I think to do that, it would help to see what other aspects of the ecosystem of science are at play. So I'm going to discuss the science advisor role. These two are inverted. I'll talk about science education before I talk about science communication, but then I'll try to bring these all together as we think about how the value-free ideal has had these social consequences for science. I'll conclude with some thoughts about what I think this means for trust in science, which is obviously a topical matter, but really look forward to the discussion that we have afterwards. So let's start with some caveats. When I talk about science, I'm thinking of science as something epistemic, ethical, because obviously there are ethical concerns internal to science with respect to deciding what is responsible research, what does it mean to be able to replicate our findings, and questions of authorship, especially with new developments in AI. There are also questions external to science with respect to thinking about research agendas. Who should set them? What should they be? Or broader subjects like what is the proper test subject or test material, human, animal, we could go on. But there's also a political dimension here that is integral to understanding science and society and trust in science. And this is the political dimension. Science is all these things. And for that reason, philosophy of science as a field should grapple with the normative aspects of science. There's interesting work to be done here, and I hope that my work speaks to that. So let me start by saying, although I do talk about science, and this is a global phenomenon, what this research has built into it is some limitation in that I'm really speaking or can only speak to certain conditions in the global north, specifically the United States, to a certain extent Canada, and the United Kingdom. This doesn't mean I don't think there are implications for this research elsewhere, or I don't think we could talk about the value-free ideal elsewhere, but that's research beyond my purview at the moment. However, I very much look forward to reading it once it comes to fruition, or if it is already there, please let me know. I'm also going to be talking about science in the post-World War II context in the United States or the global north, because at this period in time on the brink of the Cold War, there's quite an impetus and energy and a coming together of different concepts and norms that really make the value-free ideal attractive, and I think really help to solidify this concept in both the scientific community and the minds of publics. So it's also worth noting that what I'm going to talk about today, which is here in purple, so the science advisor role, science communication, science education, or the social consequences inter to science, are the second part of a research project that Heather Douglas and I have been thinking about that complements what we think of as the social contract for science. So intra to science being this focus on basic science, a freedom from responsibility, and the use of linear funding for science. So although I'll highlight this framing in the talk, it won't be my focus. It's something we can talk about in discussion, but we do see these two pieces fitting together to give you a broader ecosystem of science in society. So, as I said, we're thinking about science in a post-World War II world. And in this phase, in this place, we're on the cusp of understanding science's successes and failures. We have new weapon systems like proximity fuses that come out of World War II. We also have new life-saving measures like DDT for typhus and penicillin to save bacterial infections that are really impressive. We think of science not only for its nuclear capabilities, but also for how it helps us in our everyday lives. But that then begs the question of what should we fund? What sort of science? Science that can have quite harmful consequences, this sort of science that seems to have an immediate, maybe broader benefit for people. And how do we distinguish the two? And part of the struggle to answer that, or part of the attempt to answer that, comes from the Society for Freedom in Science, or the SFS, which is founded in the UK in the 1940s. And they bring the idea that what we should fund is basic science. And this science, or what is considered good basic science, should be decided on by scientists themselves. And what's more, this focus on basic science should allow scientists a freedom from responsibility. This idea eventually expands to the US context in 1944 and really takes hold in works like Vannevar Bush's Science, the Endless Frontier. And again, I'll emphasize that we expect scientists to be engaged in basic research, but not responsible for the deleterious social impacts it might have. So this sort of brings us to the social contract of science, where you have this distinction between pure or basic and applied science. 2, a freedom from responsibility, not just bureaucratic direction or managerial interference, but also funding directed by scientists to scientists from the public purse. And what's, I think, quite core to thinking about the relationship between the value-free ideal and science communication later on is that the value-free ideal falls out of this social contract. And because it seems like the best way to go about getting these 3 items, the implications of that for science communication, science education, and the science advisor role seem to be inevitable and desirable. I'll point to the context of funding the linear model for science here, because it's something I'll come back to again, just to show that it's not only linear, but in some ways intuitive. If we fund basic research, we'll then be able to generate a pool of scientific information or knowledge that can be mined for applied research and public goods. And the expectation here is that, if I didn't make clear earlier, is that publics are funding the basic science. Because certainly private enterprise couldn't be expected to put the seed cord, the initial funds in, not knowing how much further down the line it would take to generate profit or public good for that matter. However, we know that the linear model isn't actually how science works. Maybe part of the funding, but it doesn't account for private funding, which is an important part of the science as an enterprise. But what's more, basic and applied research are not independent entities. They mutually inform one another, and many of research discovery has come from applied research. So not only is that one problem, but it also might not be the desirable way we want science to be carried out. So let me move now to the science advisor role, because understanding this is a part of understanding how science communication comes to look as it does. And I'll mention that throughout this talk, I've used some AI generated images. And this one I kept, even though some of the prompts generated some terrible images, because I think this one actually captures something interesting. It's a scientist holding some sort of scientific beaker, but with an institution inside. And the role of institutions here is quite important. So for the science advisor role, you have the importance of science and society making the arguments for scientists themselves. There are simply too many scientific and technical challenges that arise at this time in the wake of the Cold War, to ignore science or to not have scientists directly involved in decision making or in governments who will then, or policymakers who will then go on to make decisions. And at this time, scientists in academic institutions are considered the elite of the scientific community. Their advice and consultation builds the advisory practices of the Cold War. And although the scientific advisor wielded political power, what is crucial to them maintaining that power is issuing politics. And only if the science advisor is properly independent of politics and political pressures are they presumed to be present or to present science accurately in their advice. What's more, rather than pursuing political goals, the science advisor elite had the widely shared goal to protect the integrity of science, or ensure respect for scientific knowledge and the means and institutions through which we acquire it. This allows science advisors to ensure that the practice of science continues unfettered and undamaged. This is part of science advisors' central political agenda to protect the continuation of research, which, given the linear model already in place and control scientists had over how basic research was directed, was also construed as an apolitical agenda. However, as attractive, perhaps an apolitical science advisor seemed, by the 1970s, this ideal could no longer be maintained. Science advisors were in the thick of public disputes about important contemporary political issues. We see this in the Nixon presidency, where he accuses some of his science advisors of disloyalty. And as a result, we have a reconstruction of what the science advisor role looks like. So rather than fully recognizing the inherently political nature of science advising, the model shifts to one of collective management of advice, attending more carefully to makeup of advisory panels, ensuring balance, as well as enshrining legal requirements for transparency of advice. And transparency is something I'll mention briefly when we talk about trust in science, but the legacy of this, I think, continues. And this is enacted in the 1972 US Federal Advisory Committee Act. So with this idea of science advisors, at least starting as apolitical, but certainly championing science, it's unsurprising then that some of these science advisors did a great amount of work to push for things like science education. And when we think about science education as perhaps setting the store of basic facts, I'll clarify here that when I talk about science education, I'm talking about kindergarten through grade 12, compulsory education, wherein the learner doesn't quite decide what it is that they'd like to learn, which is different than science communication that's informal, age independent, and a lot more open to individuals' interests. So what's interesting, I think, about science education is that it really, and at least in the United States, takes off after the launch of Sputnik. And part of that is because of the security threat that it signaled to Americans. With scientists and policymakers responded first by moving up the launch of their own satellite, Explorer 1, aboard the Vanguard, which unfortunately exploded shortly after launch. But this prompted the US to pass the National Defense Education Act to strengthen the national defense and to encourage and assist the expansion and improvement of educational programs to meet critical national needs. And this comes from the House of Representatives Conference Report. So there's a clear recognition that, or realization that science is not only important, but we're underprepared in some way. And so a lot of resources are invested into making science education better. It solidifies teaching science as a national priority. And so with this science education, the law provides public funding for science, math, and foreign language training for students and teachers at the elementary, secondary, and post-secondary levels. With more students studying science, we see an improvement of the quality of their education and the development of new information technologies, with the aim of these efforts to seed more science literate publics and begin training the next generation of scientists. So there are certainly motivations for this increase in science education. And for us as philosophers to think about why science education and science communication present science as it does, I think it's worth understanding not only some of the historical context that is at play here, but also the conceptual structure for these efforts. So let me talk then a bit about science literacy and how these decisions about what norms of science to follow really come into action. So with the idea that science literacy is essential to civic life and to public support for science means that science education had to be geared towards creating a foundation of scientific understanding in line with the norms of science literacy. And for pedagogy scholars, in consultation with scientists, science advisors, philosophers of science, and STS scholars, there was a convergence on the idea that science education should make students science literate about the nature of science. So I'll use this definition of the nature of science provided by et al. Kellick, and that is that the nature of science is tentative, so subject to change, empirical, based on and or derived from observations of the natural world, theory-laden, partially the product of human inference, imagination, and creativity, involves the invention of concepts and explanations, and socially and culturally embedded. So note here the really value-rich description of nature of science, product of human inference, creativity, socially and culturally embedded. What an opportunity to talk about non-epistemic values. But there are different motivations for teaching science that have a lot to say and a lot to influence about what actually comes through in the classroom. And I'm not sure the familiarity of the audience with science education, so I'm just going to briefly go through some of these arguments. The utilitarian arguments suggesting that science education is important for everyday life, again, value rich, which is made easier by an understanding of science, some appreciation of the logical processes of science, as well as the findings of science. It assumes concepts like rational thinking or the ability to demarcate relevant information, analyze it, and use it to draw a conclusion to be desirable teaching topics, and favors practical problem solving abilities. So the idea that knowing more science would make individuals' lives better. There's also the cultural argument, saying that science is one of humanity's greatest achievements, again, rich in non-epistemic values here, serving as an undercurrent for much of public life and discourse, where people ought to be educated about science in relation to its cultural impact. And this position advocates that in order to enhance public participation in science, publics must be able to engage scientific cultures and understand all the social avenues science intersects with. There's also the democratic argument, considering the moral and political consequences of living in a socio-technological society with a predominance of science, resulting in more reliance on experts. And as such, we afford scientists a higher degree of epistemic authority by them being experts. And the economic argument, which holds the most influence because of how lucrative STEM is for both the individuals who pursue science and society as a whole. And the idea is that by investing in science education, we can train scientists who create a wealth of basic research, and that, if appropriately funded, will generate a pool of knowledge from which socially beneficial applications can be crafted. So given these four, I think it might not come as a surprise that one fits quite well with the linear model for funding science already in play, and that's the economic model. And what's more, Although the economic model or the economic argument for science education is one reason to teach science, it doesn't actually tell us what aspects of science to teach. That decision is taken by deciding on teaching the consensus view, looking at the unequivocal and uncontested aspects of the nature of science, or the ones with broad scientific agreement around them. And so I'll just pause here for one more second to stress that what's, I think, difficult to capture and articulate here is that although the consensus view allows for this rich definition of the nature of science that includes the social and cultural elements of science and situates science in society with what we would imagine are a set of non-epistemic and epistemic values, in practice, because at the same time, there's an emphasis to teach to the test, there's measurements of science literacy continuously being conducted, and I'll come back to science literacy when we talk about science communication. There's a stress on not only teaching what we think the next generation of scientists will need as per the economic model, but also to stress and teach what can be best evaluated. And in many cases, that's the findings of science. So I think then if we consider the linear model for science education, of the linear model for funding science, if we think about science education, it sort of fits well when we think about how science funding from the public purse goes into basic science. Well, why not use some of those public funds to fund science education, which can then either train the next generation of scientists, or at least make people more sympathetic to science to continue funding it. Okay, so let me move to science communication here. And I thought this picture was a useful tool to think about science communication because you have all these individuals directed, with their attention directed towards what I think is a singular source. I imagine is a singular source. And I think that does well to capture what science communication looks like in this 1950s, let's say to 1970s timeline. So we have this idea that the public needs to understand certain aspects of science crucial to public policy and to support and fund basic science. The institutionalization of research and the specialization of science into subdisciplines is crucial to this framing. With this division of science, it really calls into question the public's ability to keep up with science. And so eventually science is deemed a little too complicated for lay audiences to understand. As the public is assumed to be unable to comprehend science on their own, we have conduits between science and society increasingly deemed necessary. And this conduit role is really taken up by science communication specialists, so science journalists, popularizers, exhibit designers, who are now charged with transforming raw scientific knowledge into consumable content meant to grow public understanding of science. These science communicators are disseminating information for scientists, and it's popularized in a unidirectional diffusionist model of communication. This allows scientists to no longer have to communicate to publics directly. And this allows the distance between publics and scientists to grow, as well as the separation between scientists and society's values. So let me take a brief side here to talk about science communication pre-World War II, even earlier than World War I in some ways, because I think the contrast is really important here. So in the 18th and 19th century, you have popular science books being written, like Algaroti's Newtonianism for Ladies and Le Tour du Monde, although science communication, science fiction, Le Tour du Monde en 90 jours. I think what's I think what's important here is that it stresses an accessibility and a closer relationship expected between publics and science and scientists than what we see post-World War II. I think this is exemplified really well in terms of the 18th century World's Fairs, where you could even have met Nikola Tesla and come face to face with science and discovery and scientists in an intimate way that is not seen in later years. This idea that science should be available to publics continues into the late 19th century and into the earlier 20th, with science lectures continually printed in newspapers. And again, this idea that publics are active in their engagement with science and they're able to learn from scientists directly, which is a stark contrast from the idea that science is so now hyper-specialized that we couldn't even expect publics to try and engage it. So coming back to our post-World War II period, you have diffusionist communication reinforced throughout the 1950s with the development of science literacy as a concept. We see that with science literate publics thought to be more interested and supportive of science and better positioned for decision-making, instrumental to producing the next generation of scientists, but ultimately kept at arm's length from science itself. The popularity of science literacy as a social goal endured throughout the 1950s and 1960s. Again, I think this image captures something about what we might imagine the enthusiasm for 1950s science communication to be, this great time in science and human accomplishment that has publics in awe and admiration of science and eager to learn more of it from those qualified to translate the complexity of science itself. However, public science literacy peaking between the launch of Sputnik in 1957 and the moon landing in 1969 is a myth. Realistically, during this time, science literacy levels were found to be mid-range and stable. So although there was certainly some enthusiasm, the actual increase in scientific knowledge that individuals had didn't seem to equate or pan out. So through communicators, scientists were able to transmit scientific information, presumably encouraging science literacy and support for science, while remaining separate from society and free to criticize distortions or sensationalism around science. This benefited scientists because they were recognized for their epistemic expertise, whereas a homogeneous public was conceived as generally ignorant of science and in need of more information about science. This is most clearly evidenced in the rise and sustained popularity of the deficit model between the 1960s and the 1980s. And again, publics are expected to learn science, but not engage it directly. So I will say briefly, for those who might be unfamiliar with the deficit model, it stresses that what publics need to know more science and to understand more science is just more exposure to scientific information. And even after repeated evaluations of stubbornly unchanging public science literacy, even by the 1990s, the deficit model's popularity begins to falter, but never really dies out. And it's still used or relied on by science communicators today, despite it being perhaps not the best model for science communication to use in the majority of circumstance. And so I think for that reason, we might see science communication fitting into this linear model of funding for science and the consequences for science as something, at least in this understanding of science, that happens downstream. I mean, maybe depending on science education experiences that you have as a youth, but it's really something that happens at the end. And it's certainly not scientists that are doing it themselves, allowing them to have this separation from society. So let me think a little bit now and touch a little bit now about how I think the value-free ideal and the social consequences for science tie together. I asked again, what should the social consequences for science be? And this is the best my AI could come up with. So we know that value judgments are internal to science, and the evaluation and acceptance of scientific results are to be as free as possible from social and ethical values under the value-free ideal, where scientific judgments are to be driven by values wholly internal to science, replicability, certain types of objectivity, and that social and ethical values, like for example, animal welfare, might be allowed to help direct projects, but only epistemic values are supposed to be used in the evaluation and acceptance of evidence. So with that idea or understanding of the value-free ideal, we think about epistemic values exclusively being used in performing scientific reasoning. But what does that mean for the social consequences of science? Well, I mean, if we look at some of the challenges towards the value-free ideal, like the descriptive challenge, which examines some background assumptions that scientists can have, which seem to be certainly influenced by social values or political values. And likewise, the boundary challenge to the value-free ideal, which says that if a discrete list of epistemic values cannot be provided, or if we can't really separate epistemic from non-epistemic values, the value-free ideal might not be the one for us. And the normative challenge, looking at the ideal qua ideal, to say that given the uncertainty in science and the risk of either making a false positive or false negative claim or judgment, means that we might want to take into account non-epistemic values when we consider the social consequences of science, then we have a problem on our hands. In the new demarcation problem, asking just that, which values should we use and how should they be used? But how can we answer that if we're not quite sure where the value-free ideal and this emphasis on epistemic values has been drawn out without understanding the ecosystem of science? So let me present it as such. I think, and well, Heather and I think that at least for these areas, the value-free ideal has had an influence in how the science advisor is conceived, what science education teaches, and how science communication views publics. And as I mentioned earlier, if we think of the value-free ideal falling out of the social contract for science, which of course I'm happy to speak more about in the Q&A, I think what's interesting here is that in the science advisor role, as like with science education and with science communication, there's either a separation of scientists from society or a minimizing or a dwarfing of those non-epistemic values, making them even less tempting to utilize in science itself. So let me take a moment to look at the science advisor role here. The value of science advising to the policymaker was found in the transmission of objective, disinterested truths from the scientific community to the political realm. And this provided the scientist's authority to speak in the political realm. But this independent, apolitical science advisor depended on science itself being a value-free political endeavor. This value-free characteristic, again, very sympathetic to the value-free ideal. For science education, the nature of science, this very rich conception, including that science is a human endeavor and that it's socially situated, once filtered through the consensus view, results in non-epistemic values being excluded because the consensus view stresses agreement. And if there's no agreement for how values should be used in science, obviously given the debate in philosophy, and I think even within science itself in certain ways, this cannot be communicated in classrooms. And because of that, already you have the next generation of scientists and publics not thinking about science with these non-epistemic concerns in mind, or aware of where they might play a role. And even though the consensus view is remodeled in the 2000s in order to include authentic cases of science and society by the 2010s, revisions to the model ultimately miss out on some of the important value-based disputes crucial to public understanding of science. And what I think is interesting about science communication, and what I promised to talk about here in this talk, and I've given you, I think, maybe a bigger picture than you bargained for, was that the focus on scientists as exclusive knowers and the inability for publics, social and political values to enter science under the unidirectional deficit model of science communication really seem to support the value-free ideal. If you have scientists already buffered from society with a science communicator, and publics have no way to communicate their concerns, their values to scientists themselves, because the deficit model is only from scientists to communicator to publics, then some of those non-epistemic values will get lost. There's no or very little channel for bidirectional communication here. And part of the reason why the deficit model, although it has been criticized at length, never quite goes away is due to its ability to redefine where the deficit is. Unsurprisingly, the deficit is almost always located within the public or the source of the problem, whether they have the wrong attitudes towards science or they're not interested in science. The common trend or the denominator is publics themselves, whether it could be a cognitive deficit, and more recently, a trust deficit. The problem is never with science's values or science itself. So let me end on a few thoughts and to think about more what this means, what the value-free ideal, how the implications it has had in science education and science communication extend beyond just philosophy of science. So how people react to science, I think, has a lot to do with how science engages them. And part of that comes from how they're obviously educated about science and how science is communicated. And we've seen most recently in these times, this strong challenge to science, scientific authority, epistemic authority, and this what we've called a crisis of trust in science. And I'm not the only thinker to think that. This is partially right, but science is maybe not the real target of the criticism. I think there is a crisis of trust, and I think this crisis of trust can explain a lot of the debate and the discussion going on around how science should situate itself in society. But what's important to note here is that trust in science is still relatively high. People are very specific about what sciences they trust and distrust. GMOs and vaccines might be controversial, but trust in general relativity might stay high. And these important nuances are important to understand why and how this challenging discussion about trust should go forward. And if the issue is really science itself, then there's certainly a discussion to have there. But I suspect part of the bigger discussion that needs to be had is a discussion about science's values, and specifically these non-epistemic values, how they're being considered or not. This is why thinking about science education and science communication and how epistemic and non-epistemic values in science are communicated in these avenues or not is a relevant part of understanding trust in science and science as a human endeavor. So if I can leave you with a few takeaways, it's that the value-free ideal didn't and doesn't act alone. It falls out a lot of ways from the social contract of science, so that the idea of a freedom from responsibility, funding from the public purse, and that funding going to basic science. This has implications for how we think about science. And we see this in the independent science advisor role, how this individual or individuals are situated, or at least historically have been situated in government, but seen as independent or assumed to be relying on value-free science. We also say, I think, implications for how we think about values in science and science communication, particularly in the deficit model, with the idea that publics not only can't contribute to the epistemic authority of science or offer any epistemic scientific contributions to science, but more so their values should most definitely be kept separate. And the deficit model does a great job to do that. And lastly, in science education as well, the idea that what we're going to teach about science are the dimensions of science that have agreement around them. And although this might work for certain findings of science, or maybe even communicating and teaching certain methods of science, it certainly doesn't get at the really rich and ultimately difficult discussion of what values to include in science. And these all work together in a lot of ways to keep science isolated from societal pressures, values, and responsibilities. Having a more complete understanding of this conceptual terrain, we believe, will better aid the development of a better model for science and society, one that can grapple with the value-ladenness of science while still protecting what is normally valuable about science. Let us not forget, science is the most reliable way to learn about the natural world, even if it is imperfect. And what we aim with this critique and this acknowledgement of the way non-epistemic values have or have not been included in the social contract for science, but more so in the consequences, is to improve and to help better situate science in society. But this is a very challenging and difficult endeavor. And so I asked my AI one more time, if with this description, what might we hope for? And the best it could produce was this convoluted, complex, tangled narrative. And I think that's actually a very good summary for the challenge ahead of us. But I do believe it is a worthy one. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ty. That was wonderful. So now we will turn to our commentator, Ben McMyler, who is an affiliate of the philosophy department here at the University of Minnesota, as well as an affiliate of the Minnesota Center for Philosophy of Science. And Ben, I'm turning things over to you. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Alan, and thank you, Ty, for that really interesting and thought-provoking paper. So what I'm going to try to do here very quickly is just raise a few, I take them to be clarificatory questions that will just hopefully encourage Ty to say a bit more about some of these issues. So just by way of a little bit of review, so the value-free ideal for science contends that scientists should minimize the influence of certain kinds of values, moral, social, political values, in the processes of scientific reasoning itself. So in gathering evidence, evaluating theories, drawing scientific conclusions. that's consistent with the thought that values can play a role in shaping the kind of research projects we decide to pursue, and a role in disseminating how we go about disseminating and applying scientific knowledge socially. But according to this value-free ideal, the thought is that these kinds of moral, social, political values shouldn't play a role in scientific reasoning itself. Now, as Ty points out, that idea has come in for a lot of criticism by theorists who've argued that the processes of scientific reasoning themselves are shot through with value judgments. So this purported separation between scientific activity and social values envisioned by the value-free ideal and the associated social contract for science is a myth. So in the paper, in the talk, Ty argues that the value-free ideal and the associated social contract for science, the linear funding model for science, has influenced a whole set of concepts and norms concerning the relationship between science and society, where those concepts and norms form a kind of ecosystem that in turn supports the value-free ideal and the social contract for science. So if the value-free ideals and the social contract are a myth, if they're problematic, if we should reject them, then the whole social ecosystem that supports them might be equally problematic and will have to be rethought as well. Ty here focuses on 3 components of this ecosystem: science advice, science education, science communication. What Ty is claiming, I take it, is that the value-free ideal has shaped the way in which these components have been structured and conceptualized, and it's done so in ways that are themselves problematic. They're not problematic simply in virtue of incorporating values, which is actually consistent with the value-free ideal, but they're problematic in and of themselves. So I'd just like to have a better understanding of what exactly is problematic about these components. So one possibility that's raised, that Ty raises frequently, is that these components are problematic due to the way in which they reinforce the separation between science and society proposed by the value-free ideal. Another possibility is that these components, science advising, communication, education, are problematic due to the way in which they've failed to realize their own ends, due to the way in which they've been shaped by the value-free ideal. So are they problematic because of the way in which they support the value-free ideal, or are they problematic in their own right because of the way in which they've been shaped by the value-free ideal? Or are they problematic in both these ways? I think it would be helpful for me, at least, to kind of parcel out those 2 different ways of thinking about the problem and how they arise with respect to these different components. So let me try to motivate that just a little bit by talking about some more general issues that might give us a little different lens through which to think about some of these issues. So I think it's worth noting that all of the components that Ty has talked about in this talk, they have a lot in common. In fact, they all share a common goal. They share the goal of aiming to transmit scientific knowledge and understanding from scientists and the scientific community to some class of non-scientists, be they policymakers, be they children, the next generation of scientists and citizens, or be they the general public at large. And that general transmissive aim, the aim of transmitting scientific knowledge and understanding, seems in and of itself to be perfectly appropriate and legitimate. There's a genuine societal need for scientific knowledge and understanding to be transmitted from scientists and the scientific community to other individuals and groups in the public domain that might be in a position to make use of that knowledge. Now, the very notion of transmission there already assumes a kind of separation between science and society, but I don't think it's a pernicious one, at least not yet. So there are going to be frequent occasions on which scientists possess some epistemic goods that need to be passed on to those who lack those goods. But that's just a general feature of human epistemic communities. That in itself is not a consequence of the value-free ideal or the social contract for science, and it'd be equally true of scientific communities that were not guided by the value-free ideal, and it's equally true of non-scientific communities. So frequently there are human communities that possess certain knowledge that need to pass them on to other communities. That is just a general feature of human epistemic communities. So if that's right, then where exactly does the problem in these particular cases enter in? Does the problem concern the way in which the particular transmissive practices of advising, education, and communication, as they developed in the latter half of the 20th century, does it concern the way in which those practices serve, in fact, to legitimize and reinforce the value-free ideal? So, for example, is the problem that the deficit model of science communication injected some kind of pernicious separation between science and society into the transmissive aim of science communication that is somehow problematic? Or is the problem that the value-free ideal has actually distorted the legitimate transmissive aims of science advising and education and communication? So one more general point about epistemic transmission. So I've referred to this general aim of transmitting knowledge and understanding between individuals and communities. But there are many more particular or specific transmissive aims that we might pursue in a given context, corresponding to whatever epistemic needs an audience might have. And there are a variety of particular means that we might employ in pursuit of those various different aims, some of which are going to be more appropriate and effective in certain circumstances than others. And that for all sorts of reasons, for epistemic reasons, for practical reasons, for moral reasons. So it's a complicated affair. So for instance, if our aim in a particular context is simply to enable a specific course of collective action, then the transmission of some generally accepted scientific matters of fact might be all that is necessary. The public or policymakers might not need to have a deep understanding of those facts, of why they're generally accepted by the scientific community. Knowledge sufficient for collective action might be all that's needed. It might be sufficient that scientists and scientific communities simply tell others what is the case, and that these others simply believe them, simply take it on their authority. The exercise of a kind of epistemic authority doesn't seem problematic in that kind of case. But that kind of process wouldn't be sufficient if we had different aims. For instance, if we were trying to cultivate an understanding in this element of the public of these scientific theories or principles. So in most cases of science education, that's not going to be, this kind of authoritative mode of transmission isn't going to be sufficient. There, instead of simply telling students the facts, it looks like we need to explain those facts. We need to demonstrate principles. We need to argue for conclusions. Understanding can't be transmitted in the same way as mere propositional knowledge, as epistemologists would call it. So we have to employ different means. We might start with some kind of rote learning of basic facts, but then that needs to be employed as a way of scaffolding a kind of deeper understanding, deeper and more systematic understanding down the road. Something that can't be acquired by rote learning alone. Moreover, even when a particular mode of transmission might be sufficient for attaining a particular transmissive end in ideal circumstances, it might not be in non-ideal circumstances. So as we all know, simply telling large portions of the US population that mRNA vaccines are safe and effective was insufficient to transmit the kind of knowledge required to spur widespread vaccine uptake in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic. It didn't work. So in those kinds of cases, we either have to look to alternative means of transmission, or we need to work to repair those means of transmission that have been rendered inoperable somehow in their particular social context, all of which is extremely difficult, time-consuming work. So it seemed those are some of the most serious and pressing problems, it seems to me, attending to science advising, education, and communication. But what is less clear to me is how they're connected to the value-free ideal. So the root of all of those kinds of problems doesn't seem to me, or at least I'm not yet convinced, that the root of those problems is a particular view of science or of the scientific enterprise. Rather, they seem to be general problems attending to the processes of the social transmission of knowledge and understanding between human communities. So similar problems arise with respect to non-scientific communities. For instance, ethnic, social, and cultural communities trying to transmit knowledge and understanding of their lived experience with things like policing, child removal, sex and gender-based discrimination. Again, we have all sorts of transmission problems generated in those kinds of contexts, non-scientific contexts. So perhaps the value-free ideal, the social contract for science, introduce into the scientific domain a particular way of shaping how those transmissive problems arise. But if they do, I'd like to have a better understanding, I guess, of how exactly that works. How is it that what's going on in the scientific domain is different fundamentally from what goes on with respect to transmission problems in scientific communities generally? And how does the value-free ideal specifically enter into an explanation of those problems? So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ben, for that commentary. I'm going to invite Ty back on stage here. And while we're making that transition, let me remind everybody that as soon as Ty has the opportunity to respond to Ben's comments, we will have Q&A. I already see somebody has put a question in the Q&A, so that's great. You can also raise your hand using the raised hand function. And if you want to go ahead and do that over the next couple of minutes, we'll be ready to go when Ty finishes. So Ty?
Thank you. And thank you, Ben, for those really helpful comments. They've challenged me to refine how I write and think about the value-free ideal and its relationship to the social aspects of science. So I'll say that I think that was a fair summary, in that I identified that, okay, if the value-free ideal has all these challenges, then might there be implications, or might the same challenges be raised in science communication and science education? And I think that that's true to some extent. I would say that what's problematic, I think, about the use of the value-free ideal in science education and science communication is the both situation, where in science education focusing on the consensus view and the deficit model in science communication both reinforce the value-free ideal. But also, I think the value-free ideal hinders the ability of science communication and science education and the science advisor role to really encourage public understanding of science, which I do think is a valuable pursuit in and of itself. So with that in mind, oh, sorry, my co-host and fellow philosopher Ursula is equally interested, would say that when we think about how the transfer of knowledge from experts to lay publics can sometimes be pernicious, I think the value-free ideal skews that information and hinders public's ability to really not only understand science, but get an accurate view of what science is, because the value-free ideal really minimizes the role or the non-epistemic values in play in the evaluation of evidence. I think publics inevitably get a misrepresentation of science, so that when we're in situations where it's crucial to communicate science, there's an expectation that maybe their values will not be considered. And I think that worry can have not only dire consequences, but also seems somewhat reasonable if people have been told that science is an objective endeavor wherein their non-epistemic social, moral concerns, personal concerns will not be taken into consideration. So I think that leads to some of the distrust in science and the discourse that we're seeing around that. In terms of transmission challenges with respect to other domains and what makes the value-free ideal of particular sorts in the scientific context, I can't speak to science or communication in other areas, but I do think that there's something specific or unique to science here, wherein non-epistemic values are muted. And I would be curious if this is the sort of process that's happening in other areas as well, because maybe that speaks to a bigger issue than what I had initially conceived. But I think overall there is something to the value-free ideal in that it selects for certain models of science communication that fit better into this ecosystem of science than others. And so if we really want these alternatives, for example, to the deficit model, like public participation in science, to really take off and establish themselves, then part of the challenge to making space for them will have to be to sort of disentangle the value-free ideal from the ecosystem itself.
Okay, thank you very much, Ty. And we will now move into open questions and answers. And please, at any time, just raise your hand or drop a question in the Q&A, and I will manage the queue. I'm going to start with a question that was put in from Douglas Alchin. It's got a number of components, so I'm going to read it, but then I think that Ty, you should feel free to kind of zoom in on particular aspects of it. So it says, please articulate your views in describing a concrete communication plan for COVID vaccines in 2021, COVID masking in 2021, and climate change 1990 to present. Please comment on whether the IPCC or CDC has any epistemic authority as a body expressing a consensus of relevant specialized experts in the sense of Naomi Oreskes. Is there any lack of transparency that the fundamental moral values involved were public welfare now and in the future? And perhaps you might comment on the political partisan dimension of scientific disinformation. So lots going on there. I'd say pick up on those things that you'd like to in response.
Wow, that's such a rich question, and there's so much in there to grapple with. I won't be able to quite get into a lot of the particulars, but two things struck me in hearing the question that I'll touch on. And the first is transparency, because this seems exceptionally challenging as both an aim for science communicators to be able to provide. But also I question whether or not it's the best method for generating trust in science. And my thoughts on that come from the disagreement, I think, in the literature, at least from what little I've read about communicating science. And it seems that in some cases, when we communicate the details about what non-epistemic values were used in research, if those values align with the values of the hearer, then that seems to bolster trust in science. But if they're not the same values, if there's no value alignment between the scientist and the public, then it lowers trust, whether or not the science itself is trustworthy or not. And so looking to transparency as a blanket answer, I don't think is quite the solution. One final point on transparency I'll mention as well is that I think the further challenge with transparency is, although we might be transparent about science, seeing into science doesn't necessarily guarantee that science will be more trustworthy or that it is a trustworthy enterprise. And so I suspect what people want more than transparency is trustworthiness. And perhaps part of facilitating or growing that trustworthiness and that trust is to allow transparency, but I think engagement would perhaps do more. How that engagement should be structured and facilitated, and to what extent and what stages of science, that's very difficult to know. And I think it depends a lot on the science, but I look to citizen science projects with hope. I'd also like to respond to the politicalization question that came up at the end, or the point to it. Right now, I'm working on trust in science and vaccine hesitancy. And there is a certain amount of politicalization around this topic that I think makes thinking about science communication very difficult, and also very different than pre-COVID. And so because of that, I think we've been challenged in a lot of ways to reframe science communication in a way that's sensitive to politicization and polarization, actually, I should say, especially talking in a US context, that I suspect would prevent solutions that we might have relied on pre-COVID, like for MMR vaccines, not to work in the same way post-COVID. But I would be happy to talk more about this, Doug Salshin, because I've read some of your work. So the challenge is there. I'm working on it now, but I think values and understanding what exactly the role of non-epistemic values in particular is playing here, especially in the politicalization dimension of the vaccine post-COVID challenges, is really important to coming to some sort of fruitful progression.
All right, I'm going to take my chair's prerogative and ask a quick follow-up on this one, because I think that many studies have shown that one of the ways in which you can predict trust in science is if people know a scientist. That is, if they have somebody in their sort of social network whose identity is a scientist and they're in some kind of regular contact with them. However, we also know that there are general trends in society that are sort of pulling people into more insulated groups, such that those people who would typically have the identity of scientists are oftentimes in social groups with other scientists, rather than, say, broader public. So I'm curious to what degree you think we might want to include certain kinds of sociological dynamics in our explanation and accounting for what's going on in both the persistence of the value-free ideal and its kind of entanglement with the deficit model of scientific communication.
Yeah, that's a great point, Alan. It would be foolish not to think about science and society, and part of that means thinking about science as it's understood in social groups. And I think you're right. To some extent, people, even scientists, talk with like-minded people, including other scientists. And that certainly frames not only what they think of themselves and their group and their affiliation with science, but their assumptions about what others think about science. So I think that there's at least some need to find a way to have these groups talk in a bi-directional, real conversational manner that the deficit model doesn't afford. But also, again, my co-authors are very excited. I think that there's an important point to raise here about trust in science versus, or comparable to, trust in medical doctors. So this is a point I've been thinking about for a while now in trying to understand how people relate to science as a discipline. And I think there's more research to be done in terms of understanding who people trust as epistemic or scientific experts and why. And I think that the idea that people trust science more if they know a scientist is intimately related to how they think about or trust their doctor versus a scientist who they might not have as much contact with. So again, I think this is research to be done, but that will complement our understanding of science in society, what public's expectations are for that, and how the value-free ideal has influenced that relationship.
Great, thank you. So let's go to the next question from Max Drazo. He says, I'm curious why you think there is such a market for science communication that accepts or actively reinforces the value-free ideal. You could maybe make this concrete by asking, why are there more Neil deGrasse Tysons than Stephen Jay Goulds? Is this just a downstream effect of the dominant form of science education in the United States, say?
So I want to make sure I understand this question correctly. Why do I think that there's such an interest in science communication adhering to a value-free framework?
Right, and I also think that it's thinking about the fact that some of these individuals become quite popular, and there's a market for them in both publishing and television and other sorts of outlets. And that, you know, if it was the case that you had Stephen Jay Gould on TV, it would have been very different than, say, Neil deGrasse Tyson, because Stephen Jay Gould actively engaged values in science in his writing, whereas Neil deGrasse Tyson really tends to deliver a value-free ideal perspective science.
That's a really good question. I'd have to look more into sort of the nuances of particular science communicators. If you're interested in that, a great paper just came out called Pandemicons or Pandemic Icons, talking about why and how certain, we'll call them celebrity scientists or celebrity science communicators, were more successful or popular than others, and to what extent and why. So I have not listened to all of the works of, for example, Neil deGrasse Tyson, but from what I understand, he communicates a lot of what I'm going to colloquially call gee whiz science. And whether you're a science journalist or a science communicator, there is certain science that is always exciting. And if it's dinosaurs or if it's space, I mean, this is the sort of science that people always find thrilling, even if they're not normal science enthusiasts. So it might be apart due to subject matter, which isn't surprising given that certain people trust and engage with particular types of science different than others. But then also, I think you very quickly can get into inflammatory territory when talking about values in science that might turn a lot of people off and speaks to the transparency concern that I spoke about earlier.
So let me maybe follow that by kind of supplementing Max's question with one that's focused on authority. So, I mean, one thing you could imagine is that we have a kind of authority vacuum in modern society. There is no particular sort of source, apart from sometimes the sciences, where people would sort of concur that this is a universal source of authority for everyone to pay attention to. And so maybe in thinking about the attractiveness of even somebody like Neil deGrasse Tyson communicating gee whiz science is that it somehow retains some of that universal authority, something we can all affirm, and that there is somebody behind it who has the relevant stature to communicate it, you know, so that if I was to get on TV and talk about, you know, gee whiz science, people would mostly just say, who is that guy? They wouldn't probably even think about the gee whiz science. And so there is something about like authority figures and people playing a role of communicating consensus knowledge. And I think this might kind of circle back to Douglas's question, because it seems like there's actually something really important about it being an individual, because and we might take the case of Anthony Fauci as our sort of contrast class here, because people don't really think about the CDC or the IPCC as you know, a single thing. It's kind of an abstract entity and nobody knows who's exactly in it or involved in it. But of course, for the health policy during the context of COVID, there was a particular person. Now, interestingly, the response to Anthony Fauci was not, say, similar to the response to Neil deGrasse Tyson. And in particular, you saw a nature of science element kind of go bust, which is when there was an acknowledgement that views had changed on a particular topic, say like masking effectiveness. Everybody cried foul rather than say, oh, that's just the nature of science. It's tentative and it works and things change. So I'm curious maybe to hear you elaborate a little bit more on like the focus of authority in single people to listen to. And we might think the analog to that in science education is the textbook, the locus of authority. Yeah.
Okay, so this is really good because this focus on authority, I think, actually works really well with a value-free ideal narrative. We have a source of information who presents at least relatively value-free information, like Neil deGrasse Tyson, and we afford this person authority in part because of that. They seem to be unbiased. And that works, I think, again, for certain scientists. And let me take the opportunity to say here that it's not as if deficit model communication is always horrific. It's not always bad. And certainly in cases of crises, when maybe you just need to get information out to people, it is the best choice. What's concerning is when it's the default. And although this is changing, the deficit model does remain quite persistent. But I think you're right to point out that there is this desire to look to a source of authority scientific authority and have that individual be able to provide you reliable information. Now, with the masking issue, Fauci, for multiple reasons, mostly, as I understand it, concerned that there wouldn't be enough masks for medical professionals, did not offer reliable information in the sense that we knew, or at least some people knew, that masking was effective, but there weren't enough masks available. And so the decision was taken not to alert the public to this for fear of hoarding. And in that are a lot of non-epistemic values that are tied up. And unfortunately, it lowered his credibility in the trust of a lot of individuals. And some would say justifiably so. He was not truthful in his representation of the science. And I think therein lies a big challenge in being the focus of authority, but with a community, or to address a community that has an understanding of science that's incomplete. If we don't educate people that there are non-epistemic values in science, then when non-epistemic values are used to justify certain science, that can seem unreasonable because it's not the science they are expecting. So I think having this expectation of science being objective and value-free, and then having a scientific authority come in and give you a piece of information that should be reliable, but was ultimately decided on for non-epistemic reasons, but the public is not expecting those non-epistemic reasons to come into play, creates this tension, which is why I'd like to see science education and science communication more attuned to these non-epistemic values, so that should we reach situations like this, we can have more engaged, or at least more informed discussions about what's the best course of action to take.
Great, thanks. So as we kind of draw to a close here, I think I'd like to invite you to do a little blue sky thinking, which is sort of what would Ty hope for if things changed in positive ways in light of the kinds of concerns you've raised in terms of scientific communication. If you could sort of look out, say 5-10 years, and over that time, there was this attentiveness, there was this engagement with these issues. What would be some of the things that you would hope to see different on the landscape for scientific communication, whether specifically in education or maybe more broadly in just any kind of scientific communication?
So Ty is an optimist. And although we talk about sort of blue sky thinking and wishful thinking, I think there's actually been a lot of great work done in science education and science communication to try and situate science in society better. And so what I think could help with that in this recognition of non-epistemic values is to stay a little bit truer to these wonderful curriculums, a lot of which have nature of science already built in, and a recognition that non-epistemic values play an important role in science. But I think that needs to translate to in the classroom practice. I think this is exceptionally challenging given our, for example, testing structures that are force teachers to teach to the test in a way that usually prioritizes empirical findings over understanding rich social contexts, like the one science finds itself in. I would hope as well to not teach science perhaps in the same sort of segmented way, biology, chemistry, physics, as separate entities. I would adore to see classrooms that have these concepts mixed and intertangled in much the way we find them in nature, so that students end up with an understanding of science that's interdisciplinary, but in a different way than just learning these individually. And so that when they think about problem solving, they're able to approach it from many different angles. And I believe that if we think about science and restructuring science education in this way, that will help with how we think of communication as well. Because, I mean, although we have focal points of authority for science, there's an increasing amount of people speaking to science with varying concerns, some more legitimate than others, but at least with a better understanding of science, I think we could have a better ability to select which authorities are not only helping us build a science that accurately represents the world, but that's attentive to society's needs. And so that's my optimistic approach for how science might move forward. And again, this optimism comes from a lot of positive work that's already transpired and a lot of emerging interesting work in public participation in science and citizen engagement with science that I think will really change science in a way that makes it a bit more accessible and give it the attention it deserves.
Well, I think that's a great note to finish on. I want to thank you, Ty, for a wonderful presentation and for your discussion and comments and answers to questions. Thank you to everybody who was able to join us. We appreciate your time and your investment in this forum, and we look forward to seeing you at a future forum, which we will, of course, advertise through our standard channels. Until then, everybody take care, and we will see you soon. Thanks again, Ty. Take care.